Language and Script in the Book of the Dead by Emily Cole. When Egyptian scribes wrote out copies of the Book of the Dead, they were building on a tradition of religious scholarship that had been in existence since at least the Old Kingdom, 2686 through 2125 BC. Priests who had access to libraries of text within the Egyptian temple complexes continuously adapted spells from the earlier traditions of the pyramid text and later the coffin text for hundreds of years. However, the distinction between these religious texts has largely been a creation of modern scholarship based on where the compositions appear, the pyramids, coffins, and papyrus books, respectively, chapters 1 and 2. In reality, numerous pyramid and coffin text spells were reproduced in their entirety through at least the Ptolemaic period, 332 through 30 BC, while the Book of the Dead was indeed representative of a new and innovative stage in the presentation and distribution of Egyptian funerary materials. The priests no doubt recognized the antiquity of the spells. Those authors would even have promoted the archaic nature of the religious rituals in order to satisfy their clientele of the validity of the ritual text which they were commissioning. An effort was made to emphasize the traditional language and scripts of the Book of the Dead over time. From the earliest emergence of writing in Egypt, there existed two complementary scripts, the formal hieroglyphs and the cursive hieratic. These scripts appear nearly simultaneously in the pre-dynastic and early dynastic, respectively, with the script largely based on the choice of medium, text, genre, and register. For the funerary spells, this same principle applied. For instance, the majority of pyramid text examples that exist today were carved in columns of monumental hieroglyphs because they were placed on the walls of Old Kingdom tombs built of stone. However, the few early attestations of pyramid text spells on papyrus were written in both hieratic and hieroglyphs. When the spells appear on the coffins and tombs of the Middle Kingdom as the coffin text, the columnar format was retained, but rather than appearing on a medium that accommodated the intricately carved and detailed hieroglyphs, the artisans were confronted by the wooden surface of the coffins. Large bands of horizontal text were painted in hieroglyphs along the upper edges of the coffins, but the remainder of the text was written out in columns in a schematized form of hieroglyphics. Okay. So, commonly known as cursive hieroglyphs, in the New Kingdom, when some of the first examples of the Book of the Dead appeared, the most common format was individually delineated columns of cursive hieroglyphs. However, columns of hieratic were also used as attested on a second intermediate period, 1650 through 1550 BC. Papyrus currently in the Petrie Museum Even on linen shrouds, where the shifting of the material created a difficult surface on which to write. In chapter 2, scribes largely followed the columnar format in the early New Kingdom, as on the shroud of Thutmose III. An exception is Book of the Dead spell 100, written in horizontal bands of cursive hieroglyphs that exist from the reign of Thutmose III. However, with decorative bands around the edges, the horizontal layout may have been chosen because it was a single spell on a piece of linen rather than indicating a broader shift in trends. The layout, with its decorative border of alternating colors and illustration in the upper portion, is reminiscent of stele decoration, which may also have influenced the choice of script. A particular feature that affects how the columns of hieroglyphic text were read is what is known as retrograde hieroglyphics or hieroglyphs. This term refers to the fact that columns of text would be read left to right, the opposite of their normal order, yet the hieroglyphs were oriented as if they should be read right to left. Writing in retrograde hieroglyphs was most common in religious texts, presumably since it was regarded as a special feature of these compositions, and examples exist already in the pyramid text. In some instances, the scribes ran into problems when copying out the text in retrograde writing, as may have been the case in spell 18 of the Book of the Dead of Ani or Annie from the 19th dynasty, 1295 through 1186 BC. Less common, but also appearing from the second intermediate period, were horizontal rows of hieratic, such as the examples found on the coffin of Mentuhotep, a queen of the 13th dynasty, or the fragmentary coffin of Huronefer. It is possible that rather than transform hieratic into the familiar and formal columns of cursive hieroglyphs, the scribes chose to write out the text as they appeared on a papyrus original. Up to the end of the New Kingdom, circa 1550 through 1069 BC, the use of hieroglyphs dominated the production of Book of the Dead manuscripts. A clear shift occurred in the third intermediate period, 1069 to 664 BC, and continued to a lesser extent into the late period, 664 through 332 BC, as surviving hieratic manuscripts roughly equal the number of hieroglyphic ones. In the Ptolemaic period, 332 through 30 BC, the balance swung fully in the other direction, with the number of hieratic manuscripts outnumbering the hieroglyphic examples 3-1. The change in manuscript use over time could be associated with a number of trends. The earliest manuscripts derived from the coffin text retain the vertical display of text that fits well with the requirements of the coffin decoration scheme. However, with the shift from a large object, which had the dual function of protecting the mummy and acting as a writing surface, to a portable papyrus roll with the singular role of preserving the ritual text, the authors of the Book of the Dead were perhaps free to experiment more with layout and writing styles. Many chose to abandon the cursive hieroglyphs that took up more space and stood out among the New Kingdom Book of the Dead manuscripts. Moreover, with the third intermediate period, the amount of available tomb space and economic ability of Egyptians to pay artisans to decorate such spaces decreased, which led to creative adaptation in the funerary assemblages of the elites. Patrons necessarily shifted their focus to the sarcophagus and funerary papyri that could be safely stored either next to the mummy in the coffin or in other accompanying objects. While certain spells written in hieroglyphs became common decorations for coffins, innovative funerary manuscripts, including new compositions not found in the Book of the Dead, were written out on papyri. An elaborate example of such a text is Papyrus Greenfield, which belonged to the daughter of a high priest of Amun, Nesetanib Bisharu. The use of hieratic became much more common at this time, with columns of continuous text written out in horizontal lines. However, hieroglyphs were still regularly used for the captions to some vignettes, a trend that continued into the Roman period 30 BC through AD 395. The continued use of hieroglyphs was perhaps due to the figurative nature of the hieroglyphic script, as well as to the visual importance and impact that these vignettes would likely have had on the viewer. The greatest number of preserved manuscripts of the Book of the Dead date to the Ptolemaic period. Scribes continued to write the majority of these manuscripts in blocks of hieratic text in horizontal lines, some with columns of text differentiated by formal black lines around them, comparable in layout to the category number 16, and others in a more free form, number 14. In contrast, a new style, number 15, that appears only in the second, first centuries BC, was more accommodating of the carved detail of hieroglyphs. In many instances, the texts were also shorter and thus could be written out in hieroglyphs relatively quickly. There were a number of commonly used spells that were familiar to the artist. For example, many scarabs were inscribed with spell 30B. Finally, some objects such as stelae were more likely to be displayed publicly, and thus the owner might benefit socially by displaying an object inscribed with more formal hieroglyphic script. During the Ptolemaic period, as knowledge of traditional Egyptian scripts became more restricted, a few innovative authors took it upon themselves to transcribe spells that were written in hieratic and hieroglyphs into the Demotic script. For example, a stela for a man named Harsias opens with an offering formula written in hieroglyphs, but switches to demotic immediately before providing the name of the deceased. Demotic transcript of spell 15a of the Book of the Dead then follows, which was a solar hymn that was commonly carved on stelae from the Sayet period onward, circa 664 through 525 BC. Furthermore, Foy Scalf has shown that the scribe did not simply transcribe. I did. Okay. Let me go back up. So, in the second, first centuries BC, it was written in vertical columns of cursive hieroglyphs reminiscent of the formal New Kingdom manuscripts. While the trend in script used on papyri and linen shifted from cursive hieroglyphs to hieratic, spells attested on other media remained predominantly in hieroglyphs through the Roman period. These include examples found on most three-dimensional objects, stelae, ushabtis, scarabs, statues, sarcophagi, and tomb walls. The continued use of hieroglyphs on these examples may be explained by a number of overlapping reasons. First, the media out of which these objects were made were more accommodating of the carved detail of hieroglyphs. In many instances, the texts were also shorter and thus could be written out in hieroglyphs relatively quickly. There were a number of commonly used spells that were familiar to the artist. For example, many scarabs were inscribed with spell 30B. Finally, some objects such as stelae were more likely to be displayed publicly, and thus the owner might benefit socially by displaying an object inscribed with the more formal hieroglyphic script. During the Ptolemaic period, as knowledge of traditional Egyptian scripts became more restricted, a few innovative authors took it upon themselves to transcribe spells that were written in hieratic and hieroglyphs into the Demotic script. For example, a stela for a man named Harsias opens with an offering formula written in hieroglyphs, but switches to Demotic immediately before providing the name of the deceased. A Demotic transcription of spell 15a of the Book of the Dead then follows, which was a solar hymn that was commonly carved on stelae from the Sayat period onward, 664 through 525 BC. Furthermore, Foy Scalf has shown that the scribe did not simply transcribe the text, but rather edited the composition of spell 15a to the local Book of the Dead tradition of Akhmim. In this instance, the address to the deities was kept in the ancient script, which properly venerated the divine subjects, while the personal information about the deceased and the brief wish for him to join with Osiris that was written in the second person singular, Mayu, were instead written in Demotic. The use of two scripts on the same object to write out Book of the Dead spells, as well as the excerpting of particular spells, foreshadows the replacement of hieroglyphs and hieratic as the scripts of Egyptian funerary literature. In a final stage of transformation, one of the latest Book of the Dead examples that exist from the Roman period was not only written in the Demotic script, but was also translated into the Demotic language. The manuscript, Papyrus Bibliothèque Nationale 149, is dated to 17 October 63 BC and was written for a man named Pamonthas by his son Menkaure or Menkar. It includes a text that was traditionally appended to the Book of Traversing Eternity, Chapter 12, Book of the Dead 125 and 128, and descriptions of the weighing of the heart scene and possibly of the vignette of Book of the Dead 148. The entire papyrus was composed in Demotic and appears to have been created uniquely for Pamonthes, as no parallels are known. At this time, the tradition of lengthy and complete Book of the Dead manuscripts fell out of use, so the majority of Roman period papyri contain only a few Book of the Dead spells or vignettes. Instead, books of breathing that were frequently written in the contemporary language and speech became the more popular funerary text, chapter 12. Just as was the case with the choice of script, the language in the Book of the Dead was inevitably linked to a long history of textual transmission and manuscript tradition. Because of the sacred nature of the text, the language and scripts were rarely adjusted to the contemporary idiom intentionally. Such preservation of sacred words is far from unique. The difficulty in updating and translating religious texts is a well known and studied phenomenon, as sacred words once written down are often attributed directly to a divine source and thus should not be altered, and the archaic sounds become an integral part of ritual practices. Similarly, the antiquity of the Egyptian language and script provided the spells with a divine traditional authority. On a more pragmatic level, the use of the older language ensured that the priests who were trained in these languages and could interpret the secrets of the spells remained the guardians of these arcane and complex religious materials. The professionals who compiled funerary manuscripts were invested in limiting access to textual archives and thus restricting power to a relatively small group of individuals. However, the text hardly remained stagnant and untouched. A great deal of innovation in funerary literature took place over the more than 1,500 years of transmission history of the Book of the Dead. In accommodating the shifting taste and trends of the eventual owners of these texts, Egyptian authors exploited the flexible nature of the corpus of individual spells. They combined older spells with new compositions, changed the order of the existing spells, and in later periods, experimented with transcribing and translating the archaic spells into Demotic in order to create customized funerary texts. The majority of the spells in the Book of the Dead were composed in what is referred to today as Middle Egyptian, which was the phase of the Egyptian language that was primarily used during the Middle Kingdom to 2055 through 1650 BC. and was written in the late Egyptian grammatical forms. At each point of transmission, as a scribe physically copied the text or compiled several versions of a spell into one, errors were liable to appear in the manuscript. Many scribes continued to copy error filled text from one papyrus to the next, but others tried to resolve problems in understandings or variations they found in the source materials. For modern scholars, these small differences are quite useful as a consistent error can be traced over time in a process known as textual criticism. This scholarly technique does not comment on the content, but rather follows small linguistic variations to trace the history of a manuscript and its related tradition. Most commonly used in classical and medieval studies, Egyptologists have successfully applied this process to the funerary compositions that exist in numerous copies. In comparing the differences, I did it again. Okay. Whatever. In comparing the differences between the attestations of a single spell, a tree of transmission called a stemma is created that shows how different texts relate to one another over time. These diagrams visualize a section of the history of a particular text and can be helpful in dating manuscripts, identifying the origin of particular errors, and understanding scribal practices. However, modern scholars are not the only ones who were interested in compiling and comparing manuscripts. The Egyptians themselves took care to note variations in vocabulary, phrasing, choices of deities, and so forth. The most common way of indicating the variations between the manuscripts or glossing the text with a comment was by adding the phrase kai di or kai the, another saying. This practice was not restricted to funerary literature, but it appears most commonly in Book of the Dead spells, with later copies of the text providing substantially more examples of annotation. For instance, in Papyrus Turin 1791, which dates to the Ptolemaic period and was carefully written in vertical columns of cursive hieroglyphs, there are 229 glosses with the phrase KYDD in 74 of the 165 spells. 45% of the spells or 45% of the spells. As an example, in spell 51, a spell for not eating dung in the afterlife, the author carefully noted that he found two different personal pronouns for the same passage. And my excrement variant, your through which I will not fall. That's interesting. Okay. So while the main text employed the first person singular my, the variance of the second person plural your was considered important enough to be copied out as well. The majority of these annotations preserve minor variations like this example, and many were the result of confusion in reading a word or copying particular signs. Words with similar pronunciation could also be reinterpreted or replaced as they were transmitted over time, and the author might therefore include several options in the text. For example, in Book of the Dead 24, a variant appears as early as the beginning of the New Kingdom, 1550 through 1069 BC. The spell was transferred entirely from coffin text 402, and the title indicates that it was for not dying again and giving a man's magic to him. It is structured in 3 verses that each end with the same sentence: be quicker than a hound, be speedier than a shadow. The annotation otherwise said speedier than shoe is appended to this refrain, which describes how the magic of the deceased is collected for him. In each existing version of coffin text 402, the refrain refers to the god Shu. But in the versions of the Book of the Dead 24, Shu is replaced by the near homonym shadow. and the name of the god is moved to the alternate reading. By moving the older word shoe to the alternate reading, the scribe could preserve the original text and provide a new understanding of the spell at the same time. Thus, when the deceased employed this spell in the afterlife, he had access to not only an understanding of the swiftness represented by the shadow, but also its association with Shu, who embodied the wind and was part of the magical process as well. The inclusion of older readings, which stood apart but were at the same time integrated, suited the additive nature of textual transmission that was favored in Egyptian scribal practice. Middle Egyptian was also used to compose new spells in the Book of the Dead throughout the first millennium BC. The Egyptian language of this period is sometimes referred to as Egyptian, the tradition, or traditional Egyptian, in that it retained the essence of Middle Egyptian of the second millennium BC, but aspects of later Egyptian grammar were gradually introduced. A set of 5 spells, BD 162 through 167, often termed supplemental chapters, was added to the composition sometime after the Ramesside period. BD 162 is not attested before the second half of the 21st dynasty, and BD 163 through 1 BD 163, 164, 165, not before the 25th or 26th dynasty. New work on these spells has shown that although some elements of late Egyptian grammar and vocabulary were present, the author had still intended to compose them in Middle Egyptian. These spells also include the unique feature of having words written in a Nubian language. The foreign words include theonyms and toponyms, and in BD 164 in particular, a sequence is identified as being written in the language of the Nubians and the nomads of Nubia. As a magical device, Nubia was often referenced as a source of dangerous religious knowledge, and the foreignness of the words no doubt heightened the perceived efficacy of the spell. The contrast between the earlier and later phases of the Egyptian language became more visible over time and appear in particular in places where scribes added individual rubrics, notes, and other marks to the text. A note in demotic to the artist that this is not a space for a picture attests to the language change that had occurred. Rather than write in the traditional language of the spells, the scribe, who was clearly proficient in multiple phases of Egyptian, provided practical instructions in demotic, the common language and script of the time. While the content of the spells demanded the older Middle Egyptian, annotations were made in the more widely understood phase. This preservation of the archaic language continued even as the Book of the Dead was transcribed into the later Demotic script, as discussed above. The preeminence given to the language of the original text may have been due to the performative nature of the spells, an aspect of the text to which we have little access. When spoken aloud, the older language may have been tied to an accurate pronunciation of the ritual words, which may explain why transcription was preferred over translation. Only a single copy of a translated text exists today in PBN 149. That manuscript preserves only a few of the many spells that make up the Book of the Dead. The use of Middle Egyptian was an important part of the tradition of the Book of the Dead, since hieroglyphs and hieratic were part of the writing system used to represent that phase of Egyptian. The retention of the older language likely influenced the choice of script. In contrast, Demotic was a distinct language phase that was represented by a different writing system, meaning that the transformation into first the Demotic script and then the Demotic language represented a substantial change to these religious texts. The Book of the Dead became an artifact of the past that did not survive the significant changes brought on during the Roman period, including the gradual dismantling of the Egyptian temple system and the preferential use of the Greek Greek language. However, throughout the existence of the Book of the Dead, Egyptian scribes were careful to compile different manuscript sources, innovate through the composition of new spells, and adopt new trends and styles in layout, design, and illustration. While the Egyptian Book of the Dead drew religious authority by transmitting traditional standards of language and script, it was by no means a static piece of history. As consumers of the magical text, the individuals who owned the manuscripts likely valued both the authority of the ancient language as well as the new features that allowed them to distinguish themselves from their peers. The significance of the Book of the Dead vignettes. The Book of the Dead, hereinafter abbreviated as BD, was the most persistent collection of funerary literature in ancient Egypt. After its first occurrence on a coffin dating into the end of the 13th dynasty, and on documents belonging to members of the royal family and court at the end of the 17th and beginning of the 18th dynasties. Parkinson and Quirk, 1992. Monroe, Ronseco, 1975 and 1996. Grimm and Shosky, 1999. The tradition lasted more than a millennium and a half until its decline in the second half of the Ptolemaic period. Beside totally new redacted spells, the priestly editors of the BD could absorb text from the earlier predominant religious compositions. The coffin text and the pyramid text, which had no significant tradition for any accompanying images. Only one of the rare exceptions of images in the coffin text found access into the new text collection. In spite of this, we cannot think of the BD without its illustrations, which we conventionally call vignettes. The early BD documents, mainly attested on large linen shrouds, record only a few vignettes, either rendered in color or in black outline drawing. They already seem to be important components of a BD manuscript, although in a still limited program. However, no steady development can be noticed from poorly colored vignettes during the early production of BD manuscripts to the full color renderings of later manuscripts. Within the time span of a few generations, the limited repertoire of BD vignettes increased considerably to accommodate the full range of spells. By the time of Thutmose III, the production of the large dimensioned linen shrouds decreased substantially, having been substituted by papyrus scrolls, which were more convenient and practical for the scribes and artists of the workshops and for the storage of the manuscripts. Papyrus became from then on the main medium for BD manuscripts. A widespread increase of workshops arose all over Egypt, with numerous scribes and artists who had to meet the higher demand of the members of the social elite for BD scrolls as the most effective and protective guides through the netherworld. To meet this demand, model text, patterns for the layout, and the imagery program had to be distributed. Especially in the 19th dynasty, master copies and model books of vignettes found access into the wall painting of Theban tombs, where we see a strong dependence on the iconographical patterns also in use for BD manuscripts. Not each of the 190 attested BD spells had a vignette, but most basic key themes expressed in writing were realized with appropriate imagery. Once the iconographic model of a vignette was established, it could be transmitted over time, sometimes without changes or only modified by stylistic features. In the long course of the BD tradition, new motifs for vignettes could be developed and become popular, while others were neglected and did not live to see later periods. In the 18th dynasty, the majority of vignettes showed motifs which seemed to be more realistic than the more formal and stylized images found later. These explicit pictures often expressed the key message of the spell's heading or the essential idea of the spell. The original ancient Egyptian title for the Book of the Dead is Peret Heru, translated as coming forth by day, which means coming out from the dark otherworld of the tomb into the sunlit sphere of the living, chapter 1. Though this is impossible for the mummified corpse who is bound to its tomb and belongs to the netherworld, a spiritual component of the human being, the Ba, is able totally or to allay the constant fear of the ancient Egyptians to be trapped in the tomb after interment. The Ba was depicted mostly as a bird with a human head, which signifies the intimate union with the deceased. If the Ba is in action, it appears hovering above the corpse or standing beside the mummy as if the Ba is seeking close connection with it. The Ba had free movement and access to the world on earth. However, at night, it always had to find its way back and reunite with the mummy. The papyrus of Nepked depicts exactly this scenario. The Ba flying through the deep and narrow shaft toward the burial chamber. It flies back, bringing provisions in the form of water and bread, not in its claws, but in human hands. A careful look reveals a detailed illustration of the underground burial chamber with its various rooms filled with funeral equipment. Especially interesting is the detail of an empty chair representing the deceased as departed, a discreet allegory of death. It is very unlikely that the illustrator found this motive in a model book, but he created this complex vignette through his innovative talent, imagining the tomb beyond the normal depiction of a realistic funeral procession. Two early 18th dynasty BD papyri show unique transformation spells. In one, we see the depiction of a goose into which the deceased wants to be transformed. It is possible that the goose is an erroneous confusion with the image of a swallow. The more so as the terms for the two birds are similar. Swallow is an ancient Egyptian minette, and goose is semen. Interesting. But the text clearly reads goose and corresponds to the illustration. We find in many textual passages the cackling goose beside the falcon announcing arrival in the sky. The deceased wanted to ascend to the sky in the form of a goose already in the pyramid text, and this idea may have influenced the artist to create a new spell and illustration. The second papyrus has unfortunately only the heading preserved, spell for assuming the form of a lion. A lion, figure 4.4. There is no doubt also that the text conformed. The text conformed to the image. The lion combined all physical forces with which the deceased wanted to get equipped and played an important role as an apotropaic symbol for warding off evil. Apparently, there was no rule for the painters to strictly follow existing patterns. They could follow their own imagination, as we see in the papyrus of a certain official, um, Amenemhat, produced in the reign of Thutmose III. The deceased is depicted in a basin of cold water, specified by the dark blue color. Directly in front of him, the color of the water changes into red and symbolizes the scalding hot water with steam rising from its surface. The vignette is a true visualization of the spell's heading, not to get scalded by hot water. Generally, this papyrus shows very exceptional peculiarities. it contains not only a rich spectrum of the commonly used color pigments, but has them applied in a very unconventional manner. They were against the usual tradition, mixed to obtain a broader polychrome effect. Moreover, the artist invented another painting technique. He overlaid one layer of paint with another, thereby producing the effect of a three-dimensional impression. This exceptional painting technique cannot be found earlier and did not find any imitator until later in the 19th dynasty. Although the painters remained anonymous, as no name of any painter has been preserved, gifted master artists were among them who created brilliant vignettes as miniature masterpieces. The use of vignettes for dating and provenance of manuscripts. Beside other convincing arguments for narrowing down dating, the vignettes can often deliver additional criteria, especially the most prestigious ones with human representations. Thus, provided that the deceased wanted to be depicted as a vigorous young man in top form, clad in the latest fashion, dates can be ascertained by applying studies on the evolution of style in well dated 18th dynasty tombs to the BD manuscripts. As fashionable garments, wigs, and other complementary elements are short lived stylistic features, established dating criteria are well suited for studying them. In the 19th and 20th dynasties, the wigs, both of men and women, became heavier and more voluptuous with broad hair ribbons. Pleated kilts and dresses appeared more elaborate as permanently worn at banquets. However, in some illustrations, the women seemed to be naked, only appearing to wear clothing. This is also a noticeable tendency in the manuscripts to overemphasize the vignettes in number and in sumptuous colors in comparison to a negligence of their text. In the Armana period, the BD tradition came to a temporary halt and production was totally disrupted. However, immediately afterward, it appeared revived with innovative pictorial compositions as recorded in the complex but systematic vignette of BD 17, which remained a central vignette until the end of the BD tradition. After the Amarna period, some vignettes emerged that had only previously existed in a rudimentary form. For example, the vignette of the sunrise developed from a simple closing vignette to a full-size composite consisting of the adoration of the sun god Re in the form of a divine falcon combined with newly composed hymns. Figure 4.5, the figure of Nefertari, shows the new painting technique first attested in the papyrus of Amenemhat, which created a three-dimensional impression. Figure 4.6, a master illustrator produced this finely painted and gilded scene on the golden papyrus of a man named Amenemhat. This central illustration further developed into a standardized version. Other hymns, such as the hymn to Osiris BD 183 or the hymn to Hathor BD 186, entered into the BD repertoire from the 19th dynasty onward. The third intermediate period was a time of newly arising principles in Egyptian funerary religion, which showed their impact on contemporary BD manuscripts. The iconography, full of mysterious motifs of the netherworld and magical figures, mirrored the creative and rich religious imagery of their time. To a great extent, the iconography of mythological compositions entered into the traditional BD repertoire, while the contents of text and their sequences varied considerably from one manuscript to the other between the New Kingdom and the 25th dynasty. At the end of the 25th dynasty, the Book of the Dead underwent a comprehensive revision, the so-called Sayyid recension, which reduced the confusing diversity by reorganizing and codifying the range, selection, and sequence of spells, including their vignettes. The prototype of this Sayyid recension became a manuscript of Turin, 1791, whose editor established the system of consecutive numbering beginning with BD 1 to BD 165. Still in use today. In the 4th century BC, the BD corpus occurs on a new medium, the long strips of linen used for mummy bandages. Considerable modification to the arrangement of vignettes occurred, especially for large illustrations, because the craftsmen had to meet the restricted height requirements of the linen bandages. Their main centers of manufacture were located in northern Egypt. Once the contents of the Book of the Dead were canonized, the vignettes showed very little variation. Due to this, it is all the more difficult to determine the dating or the provenance of a given manuscript. However, a first attempt at defining criteria for dating successive traditions and for potential provenance has proven successful. The layout of the text and the arrangement of their accompanying vignettes, either placed at the upper border or meandering through the text columns as attractive headings to a spell, were applied differently in the Theban and Memphite traditions. Criteria for studying the stylistic and iconographic changes observed on contemporary funerary objects can be applied to Book of the Dead manuscripts in order to determine their date or region of origin, assuming that the same conditions underlie the evolution of both object groups. In the second half of the Ptolemaic period, two new mortuary compositions, the Books of Breathing and the Book of Traversing Eternity, became very popular and gradually replaced the BD compositions. Although they are mainly focused on the importance of breathing air and a continued existence of the name, traditional BD vignettes often accompanied these compositions. The magical power of the vignettes. It is not only an assumption that model books for vignettes really existed, we have clear evidence in a third intermediate period manuscript. This document, Papyrus Cairo JE 95879, contains an exact copy of a model book of vignettes. The papyrus opened with BD 17, but what followed was a sequence of vignettes without text. The same sequence was also used for several other contemporary manuscripts. Figure 4.8, the papyrus of Urtiuru, shows the mummy in a shrine attended by Isis and Nephthys while being dragged on a boat to the tomb by a team of oxen. A lengthy set of images representing different stages of the funerary rituals often dominated the vignette at the beginning of Book of the Dead manuscripts. The copy of the model book reveals distinctly that the ancient Egyptians considered a picture as a full substitution of a written spell, which had the very same effective power. In all periods, the introductory vignette, the Adoration of Osiris, was the most frequent image. At first, it may only be considered an ordinary adoration scene or a simple hymn, but it is indeed more complex. This image of the deceased should represent him in his most vigorous form as a young, attractive man on his passage through the beyond under the protection of Osiris, the god of the realm of the dead, the guarantor of triumph over death. If the deceased was accompanied by his wife and his children, the hidden idea was not only to provide them with the same benefit from the spells, but also to have his family bonds shown closely linked to him and his status as husband and genitor of children preserved in his afterlife. By means of the inherent magical power of images, the present lively status of the deceased could be fixed and preserved for eternity. The most important arrangement for an existence in the sphere of the netherworld was a tomb after a proper funeral. The funerary scene is focused on the mummy lying on a catafalque with the two protecting goddesses Isis and Nephthys beside it, alluding to the dead's assimilation with Osiris. But beside the sarcophagus being dragged by men and oxen toward the tomb in front of them, and at the end, groups of servants with funeral equipment are depicted following the sarcophagus. Several priests beside piles of offerings are seen performing the ceremony of opening the mouth for the deceased. The differentiated arrangement of mourners in groups clad in fashionable garments with expressive gestures and the depiction of tears suggest an impression of liveliness and a copy of reality, exactly what the deceased wanted to preserve for his eternal afterlife. The ritual of opening the mouth took place in front of the mummy, the transfigured form of a blessed dead into which the mummification rites had transformed the earthly body. It was performed by a priest who touched the deceased organs of perception, such as the mouth, ears, nostrils, and eyes, with certain implements in order to animate them so that the mummy could regain all necessary faculties. The animation of sensory functions was essential for the many stations the deceased had to pass through in the netherworld. Without a functioning mouth, no essential needs such as eating food, drinking water, or breathing could be performed. The interrogation by the doorkeepers could not be answered. Knowing and being able to pronounce his own name was mandatory when the deceased was conducted to the judgment hall. Pronouncing the name was, in the perception of the ancient Egyptians, a sort of creative act which could promote entities into being. On the contrary, erasing a name meant effacing it from existence. The name belonged to a non interchangeable individuality and proved its identity. Knowing the name of any being was equivalent to obtaining power over it. Figure 4.9, a vignette from the famous papyrus of Ani, depicts a group of women mourning his death in lively detail that may have reflected an idealized version of a real Egyptian funeral. One of the most basic concerns was to maintain the physical needs in the netherworld, such as being provided with food and drinking water. This was achieved by depicting numerous offering tables piled up with food throughout the manuscripts at any time available for the deceased. There are several spells, BD 54, 56, and 59, which deal with providing the dead with life by breathing air and drinking water. The vignette shows the tree goddess Nut emerging amidst the against the vignette shows the tree goddess Nut emerging amidst the foliage of a sycamore tree that grows beside a water basin. She pours out water from a Hess vase and offers a tray of various foods to Annie or Anai. Figure 4.11. This motive was very popular at all times, not only in BD documents, but on coffins, tomb walls, and stelae as well. The motives of the illustrations often closely correspond to the aim of the heading or text passage. They can be considered as their visualization. Terrible threats could occur on the passage through the other world, which the deceased dreaded and wanted to avoid. Being punished by decapitation in the execution place of the god Osiris by the hands of slaughtering demons, as shown in a picture from the tomb of Ramesses VI. For the ancient Egyptians, decapitation meant irreversible second death, the total extinction. This was the fate of all unrighteous sinners who failed the final judgment before Osiris, figure 4.15. In the 19th dynasty papyrus of Ani or Ani, the menacing slaughtering block is placed at the back of Ani, signaling that he passed the dangerous area unharmed. Figure 4.12. The reverse world of the beyond was a permanent, scary prospect in the Egyptian imagination. Some spells and many passages within other spells explicitly refer to this anxiety, BD 53 and 189, not walking upside down in the necropolis. Figure 4.13. Not eating feces instead of food or drinking urine instead of water, and spells to secure excreting from the anus. What? In everyday life, the ancient Egyptians came across reptiles and many poisonous snakes, as we know from the many prescriptions for medication. Mm-mm. And the powerful incantations against snake bites and the fatal effects of venom. Therefore, it is only natural that they were also considered to inhabit the netherworld. A series of spells and vignettes has the aim to repel dangerous or hostile animals, such as snakes, crocodiles, or an animal called ape shit. What? A word for a type of insect. It looks like an oversized insect, commonly interpreted as a corpse eating insect. It is always the deceased who acts to ward off the dangerous beings, either by spearing or threatening them with his knife. Secret knowledge of names was one of the characteristics of funerary magic. Before the deceased gained access to the field of reeds, he had to pass an interrogation by different parts of the ferry boat. In the associated vignette, the deceased sits in a sailing boat, obviously after he had proved his knowledge of all the divine components of the ferry boat, which we see presented in writing and in image before him, as their names signified identification with divine beings or parts of them. The ferry boat as a whole was under their protection and was therefore equipped against any harm by the great serpent Apopus. The same secret knowledge is necessary when approaching the netherworld gateways. The deceased has to call the gate and the associated gatekeeper by their right names. Demon like monsters or frightening animal shaped guardians armed with knives and torches guard the doorways and give free passage only after having been correctly addressed by their names. After the period of advanced BD production, few manuscripts lacked examples from the transformation spells. As the most popular and most frequently attested spells in the Book of the Dead, they had as a common topic the empowerment of the deceased by the inherent capability of the entity represented. As for transformation spell 87, assuming the form of a sata snake, it may seem strange to us that on one hand, there are a lot of spells for warding off all sorts of snakes, and on the other hand, the deceased considers a transformation into a snake as beneficial. Although dangerous by their poisonous bites, they unite the chthonic powers and can be helpful for a successful passage. Furthermore, snakes have the ability to cyclically peel off their skin and therefore become a popular symbol of regeneration. Birds altogether were considered to belong to the divine sphere. However, the heron, also known as the Phoenix, is associated particularly with the Ba of the sun god. Moreover, the text highlight a close connection between the heron and the primeval act of creation. The wish to get transformed into a swallow is not as easily comprehensible because the inherent power of this small bird is hardly imaginable. and yet the swallow became a solar symbol of rebirth and renewal of life due to its cyclic occurrence as a migratory bird. While many spells highlight control over most dangerous and predatory animals, it may look like a contradiction that assuming the form of a crocodile was considered to be desirable for the deceased. But the transformation into this powerful creature was considered to empower the dead's own status by assuming its strength and terrifying nature. Furthermore, the crocodile was worshipped in many places in Egypt, especially known as the cult of the crocodile god Sobek, associated with spell 88 in chapter 9. In the corresponding Bignet, the crocodile lies on a sort of shrine as if it were a cult object, which substantially reduces its terrifying character in figure 419. Figure 420, 4.20, Usarhat is being purified before the field of reeds in the Bignet 2 BD 110 from his papyrus. The cool waters of the canals were an important destination in the afterlife journey. Figure 4.21, the Ptolemaic period papyrus of Imhotep shows him performing the agricultural duties in the field of reeds. In this era, the depiction of the water courses have often been simplified and the agricultural sections have been allotted increased space. The image for the field of reeds, a realm longed for by the deceased, is found in many New Kingdom manuscripts. The deceased approaches the field of reeds after being purified 4 times in figure 4.20. Water canals surround the area. Inside, we see groups of divinities and the deceased occupied with agricultural activities like plowing, seeding, or harvesting. He is also depicted either sitting in front of offerings or near to a heron on a perch, the sign for abundance. In the Ptolemaic era, the watercourses are often missing. The papyrus boat with the deceased punting it sits on a solitary strip of water. The agricultural scenes take more space than in the earlier manuscripts. Not only do the offerings guarantee the eternal provisions, seeding and harvesting symbolize the perpetuation of their supply. Do the vignettes describe how the ancient Egyptians wanted to live in an eternalized state in the afterlife? Indeed, there are several pictures preserved. In one vignette, the sun god appears in the form of a big falcon head with the sun disk, and it is the deceased who is steering the boat. As the sun god cyclically reiterates his crossing the sky in his bark, participation in the journey of the solar boat seems to be the cosmic guarantee for an eternal rebirth. Figure 4.22. In the Anais papyrus, a vignette marks the end in which the tomb appears under the protection of the goddesses Hathor and Ipet, who is known as one of the most effective attendants at birth. Figure 4.23. The end of the papyrus of Amenemhat shows the deceased sitting on a high chair with a lotus flower at his nose, the most popular symbol of life and rebirth. He is depicted 2 times in almost the same position, as if to underline his favorable position as a blessed spirit.